Welcome, everyone. I'm Holly Corbett. I'm part of the communications team here at Consciously Unbiased, which is a movement to build inclusion in the workplace. So today's topic of conversation is why taking care of your employees is good for business. New research shows that Fortune 500 companies that put talent first and invest in their people report a 50% higher profit margin and growth. So we have some amazing guests here today who collaborated together on this research. Dr. Angela Jackson is the founder of Future Forward Institute, a research firm supporting equity in the future of work. She also has a new book coming out, I believe in March of 2025, called The Win-Win Workplace, and she is a Harvard professor. We have Stuart Andresen, the executive director of programs at the Burning Glass Institute, where he leads research on workforce innovation, higher education, and economic mobility. And we have Allison Owens, she's president of Just Capital, whose mission is a world where business and markets are a force for the greater good. In today's show, we're going to unpack the most effective strategies for creating a workplace that works for both employees and organizations. So let's get started. We're happy to have you all on the show. Welcome. Could we start out by having each of you share why this research linking taking care of employees to business growth is personally important to you? And I'd love to just start off with you, Dr. Jackson.
Oh, thank you, Holly. And thank you for inviting us to speak in front of the consciously unbiased community. So I actually tell this story in the beginning of the report when I write the letter about it. This work is personal because I was raised by my grandfather. He was a factory man. He worked at a Chrysler factory, started there in his 20s and retired there in his 60s. And one thing I say about him and Chrysler was that he was trained basically to do one job, and that was to put doors on cars. He wasn't had any other skills beyond that. And I saw with that factory and my grandfather, when the factory began to lay off people, because those training and those workers weren't invested in, they had a hard time finding additional and new employment. And so when we think about what employers can do for a modern workplace, investing in employees is not only the right thing to do, but as we see that business is changing and the function of business is changing, by the speed of light now, we know that we need employees to do different things. So actually in investing in training and investing in benefits so that an employee can thrive is really deeply connected to a business's opportunity to be successful in the future of work.
Thank you for that. Yeah, my grandfather too, he worked at a crucible factory for 40 years. So I can definitely relate to that story growing up. Allison, do you want to share?
Sure, and I'll echo the thanks for having us here. My personal driver has always been creating dignity at work for as many people or for everyone, and I think that idea of dignity at work has become so clear over the last 4.5 years since the beginning of the pandemic, where we really understand what it means to create respect and dignity within a workplace and within a role, and so have spent really my entire career sort of working at different elements of that. I also believe in sort of a world where we're sort of more united than divided. And I think that work is something that brings together everyone. We all sort of know what it means to work hard, to want to take care of our families, to be part of our communities and show up in that way. And so, the connection both to good jobs and having dignity at the workplace is really fundamental for business leaders to think about as well. And as we talk, going forward, that dignity really shows up in really meaningful business metrics as well. And so, to be able to collaborate with everyone on this screen and others in sort of developing and understanding the connection for dignity at work and businesses and what that practically means is, I think, a real unifier and areas of a lot of research that's been done. And now we're sort of at a moment where it's time to, continue to really accelerate that investment in our workplaces and our workforce. And I think this report sort of does a good job of moving the ball forward. So excited to dig more into the results as there's other work underway to do so.
Yeah, I love that as work being, a big thing that unites us all. So thank you for making that point. Um, Stuart, do you want to share?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, it's great to be here. Also, just to get to be in conversation with people that are thinking about all of these things, and we're excited to, be able to chat about it. I started my career working in small town economic development. I mean, really small town. A couple hundred people, couple thousand people. And one thing that really became clear is that there were divergent lives. When you were in a community that small and you could really start to understand who was there, you saw really divergent pathways depending on who people were. I was always really interested in how you created a vital community. And you could have one that felt very vital, but it was only vital for some people. Which really got me starting to think about like what role did education and work play in all of that. And so I've spent since that time the majority of my career really researching the connections between community vitality, education, workforce development, and ultimately work. Now those things all come together, and what you start to see is that there's different kind of really important actors, I think, in all of that. You have workers who certainly have responsibilities to be prepared for the future of work. You have employers who are responsible for making sure that their business is going to run. And that comes with being prepared and having a workforce that's productive and ready for the future of work that they're investing in. And then communities who are kind of serving both as a broker for that, as a place for workers to live, as a place for employers to locate, and they're helping bridge that gap. And so what you end up with is partnerships between community, between employers, and between workers that bring that together. The Burning Glass Institute's a data experimentation laboratory where we're trying to figure out how you can take what often feel like very disparate tracking and understandings of what's happening in the economy, whether you're a worker or an employer or a community, and start to bridge those together so that we can have functional partnerships that move forward. And I think that as we get into talking about the research that we've been doing, you'll see that those things often move together. Maybe sometimes there's going to be trade-offs, but there's so many things that are still mutually beneficial and wins on every side that we've got to invest in those. We need to highlight them and talk about them more.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? That, these different elements are connected. And thank you for pointing out that really holistic view that we have to consider that connection between, workers and businesses and communities and how they all intersect and impact each other. Dr. Jackson, so you base this research on the win-win workplace framework. Could you kind of help unpack that? What is a win-win workplace? What does that look like exactly?
Yeah, and I just want to say that this research started in 2020 during the pandemic. I led an initiative called the Future of Work Grand Challenge, where we were tasked with placing 25,000 people who were displaced from jobs into new jobs with living wages. And what I saw after this placement happened were there were certain employees who thrived in their new work environments, and there's others that didn't. And me and my team, we got curious about what were the consistent elements between the workplaces where people thrived. And that developed the framework, which is called the Win-Win Workplace Framework. And those are the 9 strategies that we saw surfaced in these workplaces where not only were employees doing jobs, earning family-sustaining wages, but they're actually moving up the ladder. There wasn't high turnover. You had great reports on statistics when you asked employees, does my employer care about me? You saw that in the ranges of 80 and 90%, whereas other workplaces, it was less than 50 or 60. And so those 9 pillars really start with how is worker voice centered? And that's a key pillar, and it really underlines the other 8 pillars. And the definition we use for that is that employees have a say in the matters that matter most to them. And what we found in this research is that we're asking employees for a lot on their sentiments, how they feel about the workplace. We're not asking them a lot about what matters to them. And when you start doing that as an employer, again, how is your commute? How can we help you? we have this set of benefits. Which are the benefits that you actually need that would matter most to you? And we saw that companies that started asking these questions and then operationalizing the data, we start seeing that that employee thriving percentage went up, but we also saw that correlation to the bottom line, that when an employee, for example, came forward and said that a driving route for a driver, that he knew routes that were easier to navigate than the one that was given to him on the GPS, that helped him and his frustration, but it also helped the company save time, money, and increase productivity. And so with those nines, it all starts with really centering employee voice. And then the other pillars just are around how do we change individual relationships? And we call that mutualistic relationships. So again, we have hierarchies in most workplaces, but how do you flatten those enough so that you have management that have an understanding of the lived reality of the day-to-day worker, of the middle manager? We have a focus on middle managers and really thinking about how are we training them to be managers, which seems like an aha, but it's really common that people are promoted into management, but they haven't been trained on the people aspect of management. And then we go through with the last one, which we'll talk a bit more about, is about how companies are really measuring their investments in their human capital and seeing and taking the time to measure if those actually have bottom line impacts. So we move from this is a nice thing to do and a moral thing to do to this is the business imperative.
Mhm. Yeah, and I have been reading a lot of research lately about middle managers and how important they are in like setting the tone for the workplace culture because they're working directly with the people who are reporting to them and also managing up. But so the win-win workplace, one of the big pillars that you talked about is really centering employee voices. How did companies keep that line of communication open, for example, to allow the truck driver to talk about why the route wasn't working? Like, how did they get that feedback?
So the biggest ones that you saw in these workplaces is they actually build systems into place to do this. So again, these are systems that we've heard of before, having town hall meetings. One company is called Stone Age in Durango, Colorado. They have owners meetings where really they break down for every employee what the objectives are of the business. So that's from the receptionist to the management, really bringing them in on what are the business challenges and inviting them for ideas on how from their individual seat that they can contribute to that. And once you have those meetings, you'll talk to some of these CEOs. They said it's easy to have the meeting. It's harder to operationalize those insights and report back to staff to let them know you shared this insight and this idea. This is why we implemented it. This is why we didn't implement it, or this is why we're not able to implement it right now. And so it really takes someone to have an eye towards that and tracking and really building in a system and process to do this work.
Yeah, great point. So not just listening and allowing people to give feedback, but actually showing them how it was implemented in the workplace. So yeah, that is great. And Stuart, I was wondering, can you help us unpack how talent strategy can be an effective advantage in business, and what data is most effective to track?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think that even a way to think about this is how does an organization become a listening organization, and how does an organization become a learning organization? Some of that is going to be, actually keeping your ears open, having middle managers be responsive and ready to hear from their from their reports about what's happening in the division, what's working well, what's not, where are workers having kind of major life challenges. You think back to organizations that managed through the pandemic really well. They were hearing not only what was happening in the business, but what was happening at home, and what was, people are coming with that, and figuring out how you navigate that, how you adjust benefits is really important. But it's also in the information that the organization's already collecting about what's happening in the organization. Are certain workers moving up? Are certain workers leaving the organization earlier than they need to? There's so much information that firms have about what their workforce is experiencing, both positively and negatively, that if they start to build structure around it, you can start to build a management culture around that information. So what happens if you look at your front lines? What if people are leaving after a year nonstop? Is that felt evenly? What's going on there? Is that something that you want, or is it something that's longer? And in some research that we've done, um, firms that in the American, a thing that we call the American Opportunity Index, you can actually see that firms that are investing heavily in mobility programs and pay retain workers 30 percentage points longer than their peers. So imagine if you could make a few changes and actually turn your retention rate from 50% to 80%. That's a material win for many companies that have high turnover costs. How do you get there? It starts by being able to manage to that, and you have to measure what's happening. So you need to understand who's experiencing that outcome. Is it certain segments of your workforce? Is it certain demographics of your workforce? Are women and men being treated with parity? Are workers of different races being treated with parity and experiencing the same outcomes? These are all things that firms can understand and really kind of target and look at and figure out, then do some diagnostic work to say, hey, our measures are saying we're not being as productive here. We're seeing workers then leave out of these roles. Let's go in and figure out what's happening. This is a chance to use data as a flashlight. And I think that many of the things that are happening in human capital analytics and can really be informative. But then thinking about the business strategy that sits behind all that information is the next step for many organizations.
Yeah. And then, Stu, I just want to put a finer point on that when you talk about the 30 percentage points, because many times when we say that, people say, oh, that sounds like a lot. But if we were thinking of critical positions like nursing, an average turnover for a nurse is somewhere between $37,000 and $60,000. And so if you were able to reduce that by, let's say, 30%, and you're looking at like 6 nurses or more, you're talking about a savings of like $300,000. Like, as Stu's point, it's real money. And you have places like retail that have even higher turnover, and restaurants. So what we're saying is, if companies really measured this, this is where you see the correlation to like increased savings and productivity. Like, we can actually measure these investments in reducing turnover and actually having employees stay, 3 months, 6 months, or even a year longer than maybe they normally would, and how that benefits the bottom line. So there's definitely an economic case for this.
Oh, for sure. Our estimate is hundreds, it's a range, but in the hundreds of millions of dollars a year that large firms that are doing well on mobility and retention are saving compared to their competitors every year.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, to Stu's point, just one more. Every employer knows this. They can track this by position. And although it'll vary by position, this is data that employers already have. We're just saying, try and use this in maybe a different way. Allison.
No, I love the nurse example too, because there's a, and also a win-win-win, which the third is either the consumer or the patient or the person who's using the services. So in the nursing example, there's also really clear patient outcomes associated with lower turnover rates and less stress on the job. And, in a different way, it's also true in retail, where you're seeing customers having much better experiences. We work a lot with Zainab Tan, in addition to Dr. Jackson at Sloan, and she calls it sort of the size of the basket. So how much are consumers buying at every store in retail, and they stay longer because the employees on the floor are able to help them more, are able to make connections, and so end up leaving the store with more because there was better jobs and better operations on the floor itself. And so there are really clear sort of business outcomes explicitly, which I think this report does a really good job of doing. And there are either, in some cases, the impact story, and in other cases, the patient or sort of the consumer story. So there's a lot of, I think, really interesting work and understanding once companies sort of think differently and think about a strategy in a different context.
Yeah, and to that point, Allison, I mean, how are workers and stakeholders paying attention to human capital in today's environment?
I mean, we've seen, so, what Just Capital does is we do a couple of key things. The first is we do extensive surveys to understand, we're very US focused, so what Americans really care about when it comes to business leadership. And on that front, people are very consistently clear that how a company treats its workforce is the top issue that people care about. It's sort of the Maslow's hierarchy, starting with pay and benefits, and then opportunities for advancement, to what Stuart was talking about, for training and internal mobility. Commitment to sort of equity and non-bias training, sort of all of the things around having equal opportunity and growth. And so the survey work itself sort of shows us that there is a real sort of path forward on even partisanship and sort of different expectations for different types of demographic workers, sort of where where you're operating, for example, regardless of if you're in the South or the Midwest. The expectations are quite similar if you're talking to a millennial group of workers versus retirees. The expectation is still similar. So there's a real sort of consistency and an expectation around good jobs. And then the sort of second thing we do is we're assessing large companies on those categories. And so, on that, again, both the expectations are there and sort of the idea of leadership connected to good jobs is very clear. And there's still a lot more room and a lot of opportunity for leadership in this space. And so, in some industries, tech, for example, you see quite a sort of awareness of the centrality of a workforce strategy to business strategy. But in many industries, retail, hospitality, healthcare, sort of manufacturing, I could go down the list. There's such a wide gamut. I know that Stuart in Burning Glass's work has shown a lot of that too, which is just how different companies are operating as it relates to people's strategy. And so the sort of expectation versus the reality is pretty pronounced. And so there's just a lot of space for leaders to be investing, to be ensuring that these practices are really put into place, and putting real strategic goals associated with it, and tracking over time using the data, as both Dr. Jackson and Stewart have noted. They already have, they just aren't really interrogating it in a way that could lead to that strategic or long-term focus.
Yeah, and another common thread, I think, just to take it back to managers and managers having such an impact on culture. I know that, a lot of research is showing that managers are experiencing a high level of burnout. And so do you think maybe a way to help managers actually be able to have the priority and the space given to them in the workplace, that they maybe should be compensated for their people management, for the time that they spend checking in on their teams, or somehow have like the retention of their employees tied to performance goals? Because we see that retention obviously is really good for the bottom line, because it takes 1.5 times the salary to replace an employee, I think. So just would love your thoughts on, how do we really take the ideal into the reality by compensating or tracking or really training managers to drive this in the workplace culture?
Yeah, so there's one example that I actually take out a case study from a global financial firm that I have in my forthcoming book, The Win-Win Workplace, How Thriving Employees Drive Bottom Line Results. And one thing they had to look at is they had, tens of thousands of managers, and they had classed them in A, B, and C. A were extraordinary. They were doing all the things, investing in their employers. The businesses that they were running were great. B was kind of middle of the road. They're doing great things, still have solid feedback. And then they had a third that were underperforming at all. And then when we worked together to interrogate that third level of manager, there are a couple things that came up. One, were they not only underperforming as it relates to their employee direct report feedback, but also in terms of assets that they had under management at their branch locations. And what was fascinating with that is that we realized that there were a set of those managers managers that shouldn't have been managers, who did not want to be managers. They were managers because they wanted to get promoted. And so this one insight showed us, are there other ways that people can move up within an organization without being managers of people? The second thing is, working with this firm, they re-looked at how they actually screen for management, and that meant internal promotions, but hiring from outside. So really elaborating, what does it mean to be a manager at this firm? That includes people, that includes culture, and really making sure that they started to train people for that. Regardless if they were promoted, there was an actual training that managers went through to make sure that that culture was really aligned. And what they saw with that bottom third, they had 50% of those managers actually move up and become performing in under 12 months. And that was, again, really giving as much time and attention to actually training and equipping someone to actually be a manager and a manager of people, and actually using that as their screening for managers.
One of the things that we see as a common thread is that people often get promoted and don't realize that they get promoted for high performance in the job that they're in. But the next job that they get promoted to often requires a different set of skills. And that training, that move into management is a very clear one, where you want someone that's high performing and understands what the workers are, the work that they're now managing entails. But managing that work is very different. And managerial skills are ones that can be taught. It takes a different set of things. It's influence, it's communication, it's understanding data analytics, and kind of thinking about then the people aspect of things. I will also say, though, that there's another piece, like thinking about how you navigate an organization that a first-time manager or middle manager might need to understand. Now, some of that comes to the organization. It comes to executives who are involved in that. What type of, and their ability to communicate the type of organization that you want to be. So if we get back to some of the stuff Allison was talking about, one of the things that we see is that firms can do right by their employees in many different ways, but they operate in different competitive environments. The way that one bank might be able to compete is very different than another. The way that someone competes in a certain industry is very different than another. We see firms that have a lot of low-wage frontline work do well by their employees, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what they're providing is a lifetime of employability or employment, but they're helping to provide long-term employability. By that, I mean, there are places that are competing to be great first places to work. There are some places that are competing with those same jobs as long-time retention ones. So we often talk about a place like USAA. They compete and they have provided long-term employment to their frontline workers. It means that their mobility rates look lower, but their overall satisfaction of employees is quite high because they're able to lean in, given where they are in the market, to provide high quality pay, to provide flexibility as well as stability in the work that they have. Others can't quite do that, and they have to fit in different ways. And we see competitors do quite well at being places that promote out, that they're great springboards. They're not a long-term employment for someone, but they provide high mobility. Now, what that actually means is that in both cases, employees are staying a bit longer than they would on the whole, because places that see places as springboards stay so they get the experience that they need to be ready for that promotion, even if it's with somewhere else. Employees, when we surveyed employees to understand what really mattered, and they're less worried about staying at the same place as seeing a pathway to where they want to go. It ultimately means that they stay in roles and stay with organizations longer. But it's really important then that executives say, hey, here's where our competitive advantage is lying. This is the type of organization that we're trying to be. And we need you guys to help us manage to that, because there's the space between an executive level strategy and the implementation of that strategy that gets lost in those managers that are actually making everything happen if you don't get it right. And so making sure there's communication in both directions is really important.
And I'll just double click on that point too. I think it's such an important one, and I think Burning Glass has done some really good work on highlighting sort of the opportunity path. Just Capital, we've sort of done an assessment based on various frameworks, working with others on like what are the elements of a good job, and we ourselves have identified 7 areas of it. But the important thing for this conversation is that everyone is not equal for every company. And I think that part of the management and the middle management is that there is this sort of expectation where managers are generally told that their responsibility is to do all the things because they're all important. And that obviously does lead to a lot of burnout. And it's not always clear on what is like truly important and you're going to be measured on versus what is not. And I really appreciate the work that has been done recently to be more specific about the different types of elements of good jobs and where the connection is to a business strategy. So, in some cases, if a portion, or in the other case, depending on the sort of different elements of your workforce, different things will be important to people. So, depending on where you're managing, that also comes into play. But you're looking at workplace flexibility versus benefits versus pay, versus opportunity, and the versus probably isn't quite the right way to say it, but is instead like, where is the real focus going to be? Where are you going to measure and see real meaningful change? And then we turn to the next element, but connecting that to business. So I think that oftentimes when we talk about sort of workforce practices that are good for workers and good for business, the lack of specificity, I think, has also allowed for this backlash of like, this is too hard. I'm not seeing results as a worker. I don't really buy it. And instead, there really has to be really practical, clear strategies associated with that and associated with the business that you can then track over time and see both the business outcomes as well as the workforce outcomes. I think that's some of the really good work that Dr. Jackson's led to.
Yeah, so clarity is key and very important. Is there is there another strategy in terms of the link between taking care of your employees and the bottom line that you think is important to share from the research?
There's one that's around developing a deep talent bench. And we've seen a shift for employees. If you look at, some of the Edelman Trust barometers out there, you have employees in the workforce who are really looking to their employers as the place that they think they will be upskilled and they will learn. And we see more and more employers investing in that, and they're doing that across, different schemes, tuition reimbursement, et cetera, management trainings, internal trainings. But as a whole, we're not seeing a lot of corporations tapping into that at all levels of the organization. And still, when you look at most training programs for growth, they're dedicated and allocated to the top, 80% wage earners. And really what we see is a deep shift there, and investing not only training at all levels, but really thinking about how employers are using that as a competitive advantage. Similar to what Stuart said, what's so important is that even if someone joins an organization, they might not plan to stay there for 10 years, but they're really thinking, how can this get me going to where I want to go? And we're seeing the employers in the research are doing a really good job at articulating that value proposition, right? That we're invested in you, we're invested to getting you to the next level, and having just a really honest conversation around, we'd love for you to stay here, but even if it's not here, we're invested in you. And they talk a lot about returners and people coming back to the organization. And you actually see that in organizations that double down on investing in employees, upskilling, and training.
So, employers who really communicate that they're upskilling and training employees of all levels, not just at the top level, is a competitive advantage.
That's exactly it. And it's also necessary when we think about skills and how they're changing so frequently. A lot of folks are talking about the half life of a skill now. Whereas you learn something, it's around, we're in this age now of continuous learning. What are the structures, right, for a working adult to do that? Well, they're spending, a large chunk of their day and time at work. So it's an ideal place for that to happen.
Thank you. Stuart, do you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just building off of what Angela was saying, skill changes are happening nonstop now. If we think about, just even the way that we're communicating, we're all collected together virtually now. This is something that in many cases we learned online. Now they become marketable skills. Um, Figuring out how we then augment the things that we're just learning through experience, and people learn new skills through experience, helping them understand, help and see the pathway where the combination of work that they're doing is adding to their skill sets, the work that they're doing in structured learning, and then also in stretch assignments. I mean, you can think about someone's day job. They learn new skills. We're adopting new software that you become proficient in. There's structured learning where someone's actually engaging in some version of maybe it's through a college, maybe it's through on the job training. And then there are things that, through mentorship, through kind of, again, ability to contribute to something that's outside of your typical day job adds to that. But helping people understand and articulate that they are learning in those experiences is really important. Because one of the things that we see is workers often don't realize that it's happening. It's not drawn out into why it's important for the business and why it's potentially important for the employee. And then also other departments within an organization or another organization has a hard time understanding that that's happening because people aren't figuring out a common language to talk about it. Now, if we think about how much things are changing, and it is really changing very quickly, our ability to talk about that and to do that across a range of roles, a range of organizations is really important to continuing long-term mobility, because we'll start to see that the ability to use kind of traditional verification models like someone's college degree may not speak to the skills that are in demand today. My college degree says nothing about my ability to use artificial intelligence. It was earned before it was a really big thing. We can think about those types of challenges that we face in the labor market. If we don't think about how we kind of build conversations around what people are learning, why it's important, and how it's usable in the long term, it's going to be really difficult to number one, create long-term mobility, but also help employees see the connection between their long-term prospects and what they are learning and what they're executing on the job.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Stuart. So thank you for sharing it. Just, how much experiential learning is happening in the workplace today with all these advances in technology and whatnot, and really making that connection and being conscious that those are marketable skills and how to communicate them, both internally and externally in the organization. That's a great reminder.
I was just going to say that it also reminds me, Stuart, when you're talking about this, I was just at a conference with other researchers. We're talking about what skills are going to be needed in the future. And we talk about digital literacy skills. And someone said, well, if you ask the, regular receptionist, what are your digital literacy skills? Would she be able to share them, or he be able to share them? And I think what's interesting in that is that it is about the word. It's about making them acknowledge and allowing people, giving them the language to say what they're doing. And there's one organization called Craft Education that's working on this problem. And what they're trying to solve for, working with employers, is saying, how can someone working on the job get credit for the skill that they've learned, either through a short-term certificate or even through like hours towards a college degree, and really taking that work experience that you're having and translating that to, a path towards, longer education and credentials, and really helping people understand what are these in-demand skills and how does that lead you to a longer career, or maybe ultimately a degree if that's high on your list.
Mm-hmm.
I'll also just add specifically on the sort of learning concept, particularly as it relates to just how rapidly the world is changing, the world of work and the world overall as it relates to Gen AI and everything else is, a lot of the learnings that we're hearing right now from integrating AI in a meaningful way to jobs is that in addition to emphasizing learning, we have to be emphasizing failing and experimentation. And that's another thing that, sort of leads to what does a good job look like and how are we creating and fostering an environment that people feel both comfortable with learning, experimentation, and failure, because we have to get to success. This isn't sort of universally true for every workforce, but I think the failure point is important too, that if you're not creating an environment that people feel like they can be experimenting, that means that, they're not going to be experimenting. There's also, again, just since I brought up Gen AI, apologies. I know it's on, everyone's talking about it, but the other thing is that it's speaking of sort of equity and access to opportunity, it's something that's really falling along gender and racial lines, as it relates to both education, but just like general comfort with. And so, as we're sort of evolving these workplaces and thinking about what experimentation looks like, it's also really important that we're intentional to ensure that sort of equal access to opportunity is showing up as it relates to experimentation. So that's another point just to bring in, that learning sort of is no longer isolated to just like the roles themselves, because we think that the roles are going to change pretty significantly. And so how do we sort of work with employees and employee voice to get to the next iterations of the roles that center workers, center experimentation, and center business value creation?
Allison, I love that. And that really aligns with Pillar 9 that we have under distributed leadership and entrepreneurial structures. Far too long, right? We've had departments and people who are the innovation department. And what we're seeing with companies who are really trying to tap into the value that all of their employees are bringing are building those structures up and down the line, right? Everyone has an ownership mindset. There's some flexibility that if you have a good idea, that you can carve out time to pursue that. Organizations are doing. And that's catching on because, again, that's bringing employees at all levels into the conversation so they can, again, see what they're doing and how that could directly impact the business. And Allison, to your point, failure has to be an opportunity for that, to learn, to experiment, opportunities to grow into positions as well.
Just on all of this, I just saw that we had a comment, and a couple of questions related to AI and its ability to help kind of direct an understanding of what's happening. And I think that's actually really important to bring up. There's how AI is going to change what people are doing in a job, the what of what's happening. But as we think about how organizations serve their employees and serve their customers, there's the how AI is going to help them do that. I think that especially with increasing amount of research about the connections between firm performance and employee experience, there's a lot that can be done to set up monitors to help managers and serve as assistants for understanding how and where and when to look at certain aspects of what's happening and what's functioning. Are there certain parts of the workforce that may aid in that? We talked about using data as a flashlight. Well, what if you imagine a monitor that says, hey, you need to think about your front line in the warehousing department because we've seen a 10% month-over-month change in retention rates and productivity is down. Like that, you start to say that. Now, there's still things that you might need to look at, but you can imagine some assistants that are starting to say, here are some things that you might think about. Have you gone and done some, collection of what sentiment looks like? There may be ways that organizations can see that. So I actually think that there's quite a bit that can be done to actually start to help structure this, because every organization's on a different path. Like some have it built into their culture. They have managers that have the muscles to do it. Others are still, I'm hoping that there's a few people listening today that this is new to. There are organizations that are on kind of every stage of their journey. And there are ways through both technology and other supports that people can build those muscles.
I also, I think I haven't seen standardized KPIs yet. I think we probably will in the next couple of months or a year. I welcome my panelists to tell me if you've seen some that you think work. I do think that the next period of time on how Gen AI gets rolled out into workplaces is going to matter a great deal if it relates to workforce well-being or the opposite. And we sort of have seen examples of both, which I think are really important and just like a thing for all of us to pay attention to, right? So there are examples, for example, in call centers where we're seeing companies like roll out a chat bot or sort of a whatever the version is that actually is making it harder for customer facing representatives to be interacting because the sort of tool itself is not recommending things that are actually showing up in ways that are useful. So it's a distraction instead of a productivity gain. And so there's a conversation right now about upping productivity by eliminating jobs. And I think the conversation that I hope that those of us who are paying attention, who are thinking about this will continue to have over the next couple of years is the exact opposite. And I think, again, to Angela, your like central point of centering worker voice and employee voice, that's such a key part of it, is thinking about how frontline workers can really sort of advance this work in ways that make their jobs better, more productive, more and more fulfilling to sort of the dignity at work point, as opposed to just thinking about this as a cost cutting measure. And that's really going to be an important conversation and sort of set of learnings so we get to the standardized KPI point. But I think that's one that I know, for example, we've been talking to some of our friends at Brookings, who's done some really interesting work over the last 6 months or so at elevating examples of this. But that question of the connection to rolling out Gen AI and workforce well-being is going to be, I think, a really important one going forward.
And I would just say on the front of what we're seeing on positive uses of it, when we're around employee listening, there's tons of data points that are out there. And many times employers have a hard time operationalizing those. But if you think about a use case for generative AI, it's really capturing all of this disparate sentiment and listening and really coming up with what are the themes and really thinking through using it to propose actions, help team think about the highest leverage point in all the listening, is really a good use. And again, that's happening right now. Companies are using that way. And so I just want to emphasize it's a choice. It's a decision point. It's really about an outlook on the strategy on how you're going to leverage this technology.
I'm so glad you all brought that up as we're talking about, that this whole idea of the future of work and how workforces are changing so quickly, that it's so important that any, AI strategies, products that are being implemented are really incorporating humans first, because otherwise the AI will not serve the humans in the workforce that it's meant to serve. So really centering employee voices to make sure that what is being created is actually useful is key. And on that note, so I mean, it's not, this isn't a one size fits all, because people bring all different identities to, the workplace. So if we kind of step back from AI and talk about, what are the policies, the procedures, the benefits that reflect these individual realities that help take care of employees while driving the bottom line. Does anybody want to weigh in on that?
I'm happy to jump in, and others can fill in. So a lot of what we're thinking about and what we write about in this report, one of the pillars is around intersectional inclusion strategies. And a lot of people say, is that DEI, or where does that sit? And for us, the way that we think about it is really thinking about the employee and thinking about the lived realities that are happening at home. The pandemic made that so clear, but those realities were before the pandemic and they exist today. There was just a New York Times article a couple of months ago that talked about a social worker in Washington who was experiencing housing insecurity and was living in her car with her daughter and her dog, but she was going in government job and she's being a social worker to others. And so really we can't deny that that lived reality is not affecting that person's day job. And so we need to think about what has traditionally been discussable at work. I grew up during a time you left everything, personal at home. And when you came through the door, like that was your problem. We're paying you to do a job. We're seeing employers who are having an expanded view on that do better. And so they're coming up with benefits. And we have this as one, reimagining benefits. They're looking at, emergency cash assistance. They're looking at giving choice in benefits. So again, you can use them for caregiving, not for just, children. It could be for an elderly adult. When we look at the statistics of people who are caring for a terminally ill friend or relative, those numbers are going up. And so really opening the aperture of what benefits are, going from this one size fits all to a company recognizing this is how much we want to spend on benefits. How can we give more flexibility and agency to the employee to use those dollars in a way that matter most to them?
I wonder if there's even a way to incorporate AI to kind of customize benefits to better serve individual employees and look at all that data. Just a thought. Sir, or Allison, do you want to add anything here?
There certainly could be different ways to do technology to do it, but I think the critical thing is actually hearing from employees. And I mentioned before, I think there's different ways that you do that. There's literally hearing from employees. There's looking at the employee experience and starting to glean what's happening, especially as you start to get really big and it's hard to hear from all of your employees at the same time, whether it's an engagement survey or it's actually just using human capital analytics. But I was just with an organization, an engineering firm that had started to do some of those things. They realized that they needed to reinvigorate some of their aging workforce. They needed to attract some early career workers, realized that their benefits weren't well tuned to that, and started thinking about how they included student loan repayment assistance rather than just retirement benefits. One was kind of in the long off horizon for those early career workers, and one was staring them right at it was the next turn that they had to make was paying those student loans. They found that it worked. They started managing to that. They offered it. They measured what was happening, and they were getting the results that they needed. They were attracting new workers. Starting with pilots like that, even if it's something small and just, like Allison said, something that you're willing to have decide didn't work. You need to have an organization that says, let's try something and see what happens. I think that one of the most important things is choosing to try something. I'm not sure that anyone here will tell you which thing, but the organizations that are going to get ahead are the ones that are going to try something.
And I think that goes back to Allison's point earlier where, we were talking about the experimentation. Like we have to be willing to try new things because it's a changing environment. Things aren't staying the same. And if we try new things and they don't work out, maybe we have to reframe failure so that people aren't afraid to experiment, whether it's with, new structures for policies or, at the employee manager level. But allowing that space in workplaces of today and tomorrow to experiment, I think is like a theme that I'm seeing. Allison, did you want to add anything?
Just that in addition to that, sort of where we started the conversation is no one should assume that they know the answers. That actually most companies have a lot of this data, and if they don't, these are good questions to be asking. But we find so frequently in talking to leaders that they think that they know either what someone wants or that someone's getting by on their salary or that their benefits are what they need. And turns out that, we did a whole bunch of work with PayPal and a number of other companies on just asking CEOs to commit to measuring financial well-being within their workforce, because we talked to actually the former CEO of PayPal, Dan Schulman, had this story where, he just assumed that his workforce was, everyone was getting by every month. And then they looked, and actually he was at a call center in a community, and I believe North Dakota, and the food bank, like they showed up at the food bank, and the food bank was like, oh, actually, yeah, your workers were here the other day, like not as volunteers, but because they needed support. And it like opened up his eyes to the reality of how salaries are not always, sort of fair, or competitive salaries aren't necessarily covering people's monthly costs. And just as an example, that assumptions should never be made in this work. And it's really easy to make assumptions, especially because we sort of think that we have the same experience as our workforce. And so, just the designing and experimentation and all that, but really being clear on wanting to measure a hypothesis, and then not being afraid of the results of the analysis itself. We see a lot of examples like that on pay equity as well. And there's been a long period of time, Angela, as you started with, like, when you came up, like your expectation in a job was totally different. You put it all aside. Like for a while, the expectation is that, company leaders, like, I'm going to be sued, I don't want to look. And now the sort of risk profile has changed. Like, you do have to look, you do have to know, so don't be afraid of it. Like, really be clear what you're going to measure, the strategy is going to implement, but you better look at those numbers.
And that leads me to something I want to make sure that we touch upon before we wrap. So I've thought a lot about this in, my reporting as a journalist, that it may be time to redefine value that goes beyond the bottom line metrics that we traditionally measure success with. And I'd love to hear from each of you. What is the future of metrics when it comes to measuring profits and leadership success? Do you think we need a more holistic view, such as employee well-being, to be considered?
I have what is, I think, probably both. At one point, a more ambitious view, and then a less ambitious view of what the future of metrics can be. I think that we need to continue to harness all of the information that's already in the world, and figure out how we take action off of it. There's so much information that as it gets organized, and there's been organizations that have been thinking about this for a long time. Angela's work at Future Forward, Just Capital's work that's linking practice and outcomes in the world, the stuff that Burning Glass has been doing. There's organizations, and that's just, we happen to be the ones on the phone today. There's many more that are doing this work. We need to figure out how we take action from it. Let's organize the information that we have, help it get answers for what we want to do. I'll end with just like one really quick example of an organization that said we can't hire anyone without a bachelor's degree for some roles that we're considering. We said we were talking with them about that and asked who some of their aspirational peers were. They told us, and they said, oh, and they're gonna fit the same way. It's the competitive environment that we're in. We can't have someone without a bachelor's degree in this job. We said, well, that's true. You guys are both going to be well above average. And they were kind of doing bespoke custom work for clients, and it made sense. But it turned out that their peers, the people that they wanted to be like, 4 out of 5 people had a bachelor's degree. Now that sounds like a small difference, but going from 100% bachelor's degree requirements to an 80% one means 1 more person out of 5 potentially coming in the door every day. You're unlocking a huge new pool of workers that could go into those roles. And then helps them to start to question assumptions about why the other 4. Maybe starts to realize that performance isn't necessarily based on pedigree, but it was somewhere to start. And it was on information that they had. They could look at some things that were happening with their peers. They could understand how that was happening, and gave them something to try. Now they're going to try it, and we'll see what happens. But there's so much that we can take today that organizations, whether we get to standardized or not, can start thinking about who they're like, who they would like to be like, and try things and get there. And so I think we're still in the organization and action stage right now, that we can do so much.
Yeah. Just building on that, I'm feeling really optimistic about this moment, because we do have more data than ever. We have mechanisms like technology to help us make meaning of that data and to process it and turn that into strategy. And also, what we're seeing through this research, there are a set of companies that are thinking this is part of their competitive advantage, and they are rethinking credentials. They are using their data to make decisions. They are investing up and down the line. And the more that you have peer organizations doing that, others hopefully will follow. That's what we're hoping. And that's what I'm trying to accomplish with this book, is really to give a platform to some of those employers who are doing great work. Just Capital does the same. The other thing I want to say to employees who are listening, because this data is available, really hoping that individual employees can use this to begin advocating for themselves, right? And also introducing ideas and some of the case studies that are coming to this research. Because again, we need from all different angles to really highlight these stories and how these practices are leading to business outcomes, the win for the employee and the employer. We don't have to look at it as a binary anymore. It's a both and we can make the case from many different angles.
And I'll just add that investors are also asking for this increasingly, which is a really important element. We track performance of companies that are best for workers, connected to financial performance, and fairly consistently see the correlation at that level too. We have more on our website if investors are interested, but it's workers, it's customers, and investors are seeing the connection of an investment in workforce to business connection value.
Amazing. And we like to wrap up these conversations with one action step or micro progression, as we call them at Consciously Unbiased, that leaders of all levels can do. So I would just love to hear a quick step that people can take to help center all employee voices.
I'll go first because I think mine relates to what I just said. Take a look at yourself and then think about who your peers are. Think about what they're doing. Think about what you can do. Think about where in your organization you can make a change and try something out. Use some data to think about where you're going to make your priority be.
I'll go next so you can close out, Angela. Name a hypothesis on a workforce strategy and then measure it and set goals over time and see how it goes.
Allison, I'm going to piggyback on that one. And I would just say, if they go to the Future Forward website, we are going to have a framework by which you can approach that kind of measurement and validation. I'd say the vast majority of the employers that we looked at, they started with pilots and measuring it. And we know this is a journey. So when we look at this framework, we're not asking any employer to do all of the 9. We're asking you to start where you think that there's the biggest opportunity, measure that and see how you might scale that. And you might move on to other strategies, but really picking the one that you think would be most important to your business and to your workforce today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Stuart, Allison, Dr. Jackson, for joining our show. And thank you to everyone for tuning in today. We'll see you next time.
Take care. Thank
Bye.
you.